New Year's Eve used to mean something to me. It used to be about noise and people, watching the seconds melt off the clock until the whole sky exploded in celebration. But this time I just sat on the edge of my beige leather couch, surrounded by the silence of my St. Paul apartment. The place was spotless, the kind of clean that didn't feel lived in, just organized, restrained, polished to hide the quiet chaos inside. I hadn't made any plans because part of me had hoped the day would still turn into something. That maybe somehow I'd get a call or a message that didn't leave me feeling like a guest in my own life. Instead, I got a text from my father at 3:46 p.m. It wasn't long. Just, "Don't come tonight. This isn't a military base." That was it. No explanation. No lead up. Just cold, clipped words like he was shutting a door. I stared at my phone for a few seconds, rereading it even though it said everything in just 10 words. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself. It was how familiar it felt. How easy it was for him to toss me aside like that. I typed, "Okay, have a good night," and hit send without letting myself think too hard about it. It was safer that way. Cleaner. He'd always made me feel like my service was an inconvenience to him, like I'd signed up to ruin every family gathering, every routine. When I joined the army, he didn't say he was proud. He said, "I hope you're ready to be disappointed." Maybe I was. Maybe I still am. But I gave everything to that uniform. I deployed twice. I held the hand of a dying friend in the back of a sweltering Humvee. I came home with scars that don't show up in X-rays. And through all of it, I imagined that one day I'd come back and things would be different. That he'd finally see me. The sun dipped behind the downtown buildings, and the light in my apartment shifted to this dull, bluish hue. I didn't bother turning on the TV. I didn't want fake countdowns or smiling strangers in Times Square pretending it wasn't freezing. I pulled a throw blanket over my legs, the kind with that plush texture that never quite feels warm enough, and I just sat there listening. Somewhere outside, kids were already lighting off fireworks, even though midnight was still hours away. The pops echoed between the buildings like distant gunfire, and for a moment my breath caught in my throat. I blinked and it passed. I thought about driving somewhere. A bar maybe. But the idea of making small talk with strangers, pretending I had a reason to be out, felt worse than staying in. So I poured myself a glass of red wine I didn't even want, just to have something in my hand. I looked at the photo on the shelf above my TV. Me in uniform standing beside my dad, both of us younger. He was smiling sort of, but even then his eyes looked like he wanted to be somewhere else. That was the day I graduated from basic. He told the photographer, "Make it quick." I'd clung to that photo for years, like proof that we'd had a moment. Maybe I just needed to believe it back then. Midnight came slowly. The clock ticked forward with a kind of cruel patience. I stood by the window looking out over the snowy rooftops. Bursts of color flashed across the sky, blues, reds, golds, shimmering for a second before disappearing. People cheered somewhere down the block. I watched them from 15 stories up, wondering how many of them felt truly seen. Wondering how many had someone waiting for them. Someone who answered their texts with warmth instead of walls. The glass felt cold in my hand. The wine had long gone warm. I tipped it into the sink and rinsed it out with practiced detachment. This wasn't the first holiday I'd spent alone, and I doubted it would be the last. But tonight felt heavier somehow. Not because I was lonely, but because I was invisible to the person who should have known me best. It wasn't the solitude that hurt. It was the reminder that even after everything I'd done, I was still just too much for him. Or not enough. I honestly didn't know which was worse. I curled up on the couch again, blanket pulled up to my chin, and closed my eyes. Fireworks still cracked outside, their rhythm frantic, chaotic, alive. And yet, in my chest, everything stayed still. The new year arrived without ceremony. Just the soft buzz of my fridge and the hum of old pipes in the walls. My phone sat dark beside me, silent and still. No calls. No messages. Just me and the new year starting like all the others. With silence, with absence, with the echo of a door that was never opened to begin with. That text stayed on my screen long after I read it, glowing against the dimness of the room like it had something more to say than just those 10 clipped words. "Don't come tonight. This isn't a military base." I kept looking at it, hoping it would somehow morph into something softer, something more reasonable, but it never did. And the more I stared, the more I realized it wasn't about keeping things casual or light, like he wanted a quiet night without structure. No, it was about not wanting me there at all. It was about exclusion, plain and simple. It was about making sure I knew I didn't belong. I sat with that feeling longer than I probably should have, that slow, spreading ache that comes not from sudden pain but from recognition. This wasn't new. It had just never been said so clearly before. I think a part of me had always hoped that the tension between us was just a miscommunication, a difference in wiring. But that message told the truth he'd always kept just under the surface. He was ashamed of me. Not because I'd failed him, but because I reminded him of something he didn't want to see, didn't want to understand. When I was deployed over Christmas in 2017, I sent a box full of gifts I picked out during our stopover in Kuwait. Handmade jewelry for my stepmom, a replica model plane for my younger brother, even a bottle of perfume I remembered my father buying for my mother back when she was still alive. I spent hours picking those things, wrapping them in whatever paper I could find, writing out little notes, even though I wasn't sure when or if they'd get there. They never said thank you. Not even once. I only knew they arrived because my brother posted a photo of the model plane on Instagram with a caption that didn't mention me. I didn't expect fanfare. But I did think I mattered. I can't count how many holidays I missed. Thanksgivings, Christmases, New Year's, even birthdays. I'd get messages like, "Be safe," or "We'll save you a plate," but nothing that made me feel like my absence left a mark. And when I was home, I was expected to fill in the gaps, to be the reliable one, to smooth over the tension between my dad and my brother, to pay the bills that came up short, to act like I hadn't spent weeks surrounded by dust and heat and the constant hum of danger. I never asked for a parade. I just wanted to be seen. But over time I realized that in their eyes I wasn't the daughter who served. I was the one who left. That's what that message really meant. Not just "don't come," but "you've changed and we don't know how to deal with you anymore." I could feel it in the way his words avoided any emotion, any softness. It wasn't just about that night. It was about every time I'd come home and seen their discomfort. The way they looked at my haircut, my posture, the way I scanned the room like I still expected trouble. I tried to ease their discomfort, to sit quieter, speak slower, laugh more, but it never worked. I always ended up feeling like a guest at someone else's dinner table. He used to tell people I was off doing army stuff. Like it was some phase, like I'd gone off to find myself in some trendy, misguided way. He didn't understand that what I did mattered, that it had cost me pieces of myself I couldn't get back. He never asked questions. Never wanted to know what it felt like to sleep with boots on, or what it meant to lose someone in the middle of a sentence. I think he liked it better when I was just Madison the overachiever, not Madison the woman who learned to break down an M4 faster than anyone in her unit, who came home with a limp that flared up when it got cold, who woke up sweating more nights than not. Now, I wasn't even someone worth inviting over. I was a disruption to his version of normal. An embarrassing reminder that his daughter had gone off script. That she didn't marry young or stay close or get a job in marketing. I had done something he couldn't categorize, something that made him uncomfortable, so he pushed me away in the only way he knew how, cold, decisive distance. He didn't care that I'd sent money home during the years my stepmom lost work, or that I kept my brother from getting kicked out when he failed 2 semesters in a row. That didn't earn me a seat at the table. That just made me useful. Temporarily. Until I wasn't. I think what hurts most is knowing he'll never say any of this out loud. He'll just keep sending messages like that, finding new ways to remind me I'm not what he hoped for. I'm a reminder of a world he doesn't understand, and rather than try, he just cuts me out of the frame. It's cleaner for him that way. Simpler. And maybe safer. But I can't stop hearing that message on repeat in my head, over and over again. Not the words he wrote, but the ones he didn't have to. I don't belong. You're not welcome. Stay where you are. So I stayed. And I stayed quiet. And I stayed angry in a way that burned slow and deep, like a pilot light left on too long. The call came at 12:01 a.m., right after the last of the fireworks had burned themselves out, leaving behind only the faint scent of smoke drifting in from the open window. My phone lit up on the coffee table and I stared at the screen for a second longer than I should have, surprised to see my brother's name. Ethan never called. Texts maybe. Emojis or memes at best. But not calls. Not at midnight. Not with that kind of urgency that already felt heavy through the glowing screen. I picked it up slowly, almost bracing myself. His voice cracked before I could even say hello. "What did you do?" he asked, and for a second I couldn't tell if he was scared, angry, or both. There was static in the background, maybe from the TV or maybe just the chaos of wherever he was calling from, but his voice pushed through it with this jagged desperation. "Dad saw the news. He can't breathe, they called an ambulance. He collapsed. He's not talking. They're trying to get him stable. I didn't respond right away. My body froze in that moment of complete disorientation, like my brain couldn't connect the dots quickly enough to understand how this could possibly involve me. What do you mean? I asked, though my voice sounded far away, like someone else was speaking through me. What are you talking about? He saw you. Your name's all over the screen, Ethan said, and I could hear his breathing hitch. It's on CNN. Local. National. Everywhere. You didn't think this would, Jesus, Madison. He saw it and he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I reached for the remote with a hand that didn't feel like mine and turned on the TV. The screen lit up, casting sharp, cold light across the room. A bold red banner sliced across the bottom. Breaking news. I didn't even have to read the rest before my eyes found it. My name. In full. Last name first. Followed by my rank. And beneath it the headline that felt like a scream on mute. I read it once. Then again. And again. The words didn't change. They were the same words I'd read on the official document I signed months ago. Only now they were blazing across national news like I had pulled a trigger on something louder than any gun I'd ever fired. Everything went still. Inside me, outside me, the whole room seemed to pause. My thoughts didn't race. My pulse didn't spike. Instead, a strange, quiet clarity settled over me, the kind of silence that usually follows something irreversible. I watched the screen like it was someone else's story, like I was reading about another Madison Clark, someone who had done something controversial, something that apparently had the power to stop a man's lungs from working. My brother was still talking. I could hear the strain in his voice, the panic now rising into something I barely recognized. They're taking him to Regions. I'm going there now. I don't know what to tell them. I don't know what to say when they ask about you. What the hell were you thinking? I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I'd already lived it. I'd thought it through in sterile offices with windows that didn't open and policy binders stacked so high they could drown you if you let them. I had sat with it. Not just once. Dozens of times. And when I signed that document, I didn't do it for attention. I didn't do it to make a statement. I did it because I believed in it. Because I had the clearance. Because it was the right call. But belief doesn't come with immunity from fallout. My father must have seen the segment right after the ball dropped. Right after the world wished itself into a better year. Maybe he'd been channel surfing. Maybe someone else showed it to him. Maybe he had his bourbon in hand and didn't realize the glass would slip. I imagined him watching it, jaw tightening, breath catching, chest constricting as the truth finally reached him. Not just that his daughter had been away, but that she had done something irreversible, something public, something he didn't understand and probably never would. And now the world knew before he did. My brother kept repeating that the paramedics were working on him, that he'd gone pale, that he wasn't responding. And I just sat there, blanket slipping off my shoulders, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to him unravel and waiting for the guilt to hit. But it didn't come. What I felt was stillness. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Just stillness. Like all the noise had collapsed into itself, leaving only the facts behind. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't feel vindicated or shaken or proud. I just felt like I was watching something that had always been inevitable. Like this moment had been waiting for us since the first time he told me I was making a mistake by signing up. Since the first time I saw his expression harden whenever I spoke in acronyms or mentioned the base like it was home. Maybe the distance between us had always been building toward this. One last fracture wide enough to fall through. The news anchors kept talking, their voices clinical, practiced, careful not to assign blame but heavy with implication. The panel they'd invited was already debating, dissecting, speculating. My name kept flashing below them like a drumbeat. I turned the volume down and sat in the quiet again, letting the phone slip out of my hand onto the cushion beside me. Ethan had hung up. Or maybe I had. I couldn't remember. My apartment looked the same as it had hours earlier. Immaculate. Unbothered. But something in the air had changed. It was like the room was holding its breath. Like the walls were waiting for me to react. But I didn't. I stayed there, upright, unmoving, watching the headlines flicker like heat mirages. My face, once a private reflection in a framed photo, was now out there, dissected by strangers, used as proof in an argument I hadn't meant to start. And still I felt nothing but quiet. Not peace. Not panic. Just that deep, unwavering stillness. I remember the day I signed it, not because it felt dramatic or monumental but because of how ordinary it was. The office lights buzzed with their usual fluorescent indifference. The room smelled faintly of printer toner and too many recycled air systems. And the document was just another in a growing pile on my desk at the Department of National Security Oversight. I had reviewed it thoroughly twice. I'd read every footnote, every attached appendix, every projected consequence. The decision was sound. It was strategic. And most of all, it was legal. I had full authority to sign, to approve, to move it forward. And I did. It was a shift in jurisdictional power. Something abstract to most people, something dry and technical on paper, but something that would change real things on the ground. It meant a transition of control in certain sectors, especially in areas considered border vulnerable, from local governance to federal oversight. It meant increased monitoring capabilities, broader interagency collaboration, and less room for local authorities to interfere or dilute national protocols. It wasn't a power grab. It was consolidation for the sake of efficiency and threat preparedness. And it affected dozens of regions, small towns mostly. Towns like the one my father lives in. But I didn't think about him when I signed it. That sounds cold maybe, but it's the truth. I wasn't thinking about front porches or county fairs or my father's weekly card games at the firehouse. I was thinking about compliance metrics, legal scope, and the long-term stability of systems vulnerable to exploitation. The process had gone through every proper channel. There had been internal debate, committee input, risk assessments. Nothing about it was rushed. Nothing about it was careless. It had passed legal review. It had checked every box. And in the end, the final signature fell to me, not because I sought it out but because I had earned the rank to make that kind of decision. I didn't tell my family, not out of secrecy but because I didn't have to. My position doesn't require personal disclosures for federal approvals. I don't run legislation past dinner tables. It wasn't personal. It was policy. I wasn't thinking about how the local board in my father's town would react when their funding streams were rerouted or when the oversight office in Duluth would be the new reporting authority for matters they once handled themselves. I wasn't thinking about how someone like my dad, someone who had lived in that county his entire life, who'd once run for township supervisor and lost by 19 votes, would see the change not as policy but as betrayal. I never thought of it as betrayal. Not then. I thought of it as part of my job, part of the oath I had taken when I left my last assignment and moved into a role that demanded more from me than camouflage and discipline. It demanded restraint, vision, and neutrality. And I gave it all of those. I knew there would be pushback in some areas. That was expected. But policy isn't written around emotions. It's written around impact. And the impact data said this would make systems stronger, responses faster, oversight tighter. It was the right call. What I hadn't anticipated, what I realize now I couldn't have anticipated, was how the people affected wouldn't see it that way. They wouldn't see the numbers or the projections or the institutional rationale. They would see a distant hand reshaping their sense of autonomy, replacing familiarity with bureaucracy. They would see it as a power play, as overreach, as some faceless federal machine steamrolling the place they called home. And then when they saw my name attached, they wouldn't see a professional doing her duty. They'd see me, their daughter, their neighbor, their friend's niece. And they'd feel the burn of it like betrayal with my signature carved across the top in black ink. But in that moment months ago, none of that played out in my mind. I wasn't detached or cold, I was focused. I did the job as I had been trained to do it, as I had risen through the ranks to do. I weighed the consequences. I understood the scope. I signed. And then I moved on to the next item in the stack. It's strange how something that felt so routine in the moment can later detonate like a bomb under your life. It wasn't dramatic. There wasn't some storm cloud hanging over me when I finished the paperwork. I didn't feel victorious or anxious. I felt competent. I felt certain. I stood up, stretched, grabbed my coffee mug, and walked to the break room without once considering that my name would end up on national news. That my father would see it flash across the screen in his living room. That his lungs would seize at the sight of it. It was professional. It was careful. It was final. But now it was personal. Not because I made it that way. Because it became that way in the eyes of everyone who needed someone to blame. And I suppose I became the perfect symbol. The girl who left. The soldier who changed. The official who signed away their control. The daughter who didn't warn them. The woman who knew exactly what she was doing and did it anyway. By the time the sun scraped across the edges of my apartment windows, the story had already escaped containment. It was everywhere. On the television, in the headlines of digital news sites, reposted in grainy screenshots on social media by people I hadn't spoken to in years. My name wasn't just on the screen anymore. It was in people's mouths, woven into commentary and speculation, wrapped in anger, praise, confusion. It had taken less than 12 hours for something I had signed with quiet certainty to be turned into a public spectacle. My phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications I ignored until it rang, his name lighting up the screen. I didn't hesitate before answering. I was already standing, already bracing for it. The moment the line connected, I heard it in his voice, the crackling fury carried up from his chest, clenched tight in his throat. "What did you do?" he shouted, no greeting, no preamble, just a rush of betrayal disguised as volume. I didn't flinch. I didn't interrupt. I let him keep going. "You humiliated me in front of everyone. You signed away this town's rights and you didn't say a damn word. Do you know what it's like to walk into the firehouse and have people stare at you like you're some kind of fool? They saw it before I did. They knew before I did." His voice was fraying, unraveling around the edges, not with grief but with the rage of a man who believed control was a right he'd always had, and that now, because of me, it had slipped through his hands. I waited, jaw locked, stomach heavy with the weight of everything I hadn't said over the years. I could hear a door slam in the background. Maybe he'd stepped outside. Maybe he couldn't bear the silence of his own living room echoing with his daughter's name spoken by strangers on TV. "You told me not to come," I said finally, when there was enough room between his words for mine to land. I didn't say it with defiance. I said it like a fact because that's what it was. "You made it very clear I wasn't welcome." "That's not the damn point," he snapped, voice splintering. "You should have told me. You should have asked. You don't do something like this and blindside your own family. What the hell were you thinking?" I took a breath, steady, measured. There was a kind of numbness settling in, not apathy but clarity. A clarity that came from years of being careful with him, of swallowing my own reactions to protect a man who had never once made space for mine. "I didn't need your permission," I said slowly, because I needed him to hear every word. "I made a professional decision. It wasn't about you." "Of course it was about me," he roared. "You made this town look weak. You made me look like a fool in my own home. You didn't even warn me." I felt something shift in my chest then, a tightness uncoiling. Not relief, not pain, but the sudden release of restraint I didn't realize I'd still been holding. "You didn't want me there," I said, and my voice didn't waver. "You didn't want what I am in your house. But you were fine benefiting from it. You didn't mind when the checks came. When I covered for Ethan. When I sent support you never asked for but never returned. You liked the idea of me being useful but never visible. You liked what I did as long as it didn't touch your world. Well, now it has." There was silence on the other end. Not the kind that asks for forgiveness or seeks understanding, but the thick, stunned kind. The silence of a man confronted with a version of the truth he couldn't dismiss with sarcasm or a raised eyebrow. For years I had kept things polite, neutral, let his distance go unchecked because it was easier than walking into the fire of his judgment. But something had cracked now. There was no space left for pretending. "I didn't sign it to hurt you," I continued, more quietly now, the heat in my voice replaced by something colder, steadier. "I signed it because it was the right call. Because it was my responsibility. Because I earned the right to make those decisions. You don't get to be proud of my uniform when it's convenient and ashamed of it when it challenges you." He didn't speak. I could hear him breathing, uneven and harsh, like he wanted to yell again but couldn't find the words to reach me. And maybe he finally understood that they wouldn't land even if he did. There was nothing left to argue. I had done what I had done not in spite of who I was but because of it. Because I had spent my life learning how to carry the weight of decisions people like him couldn't bear to hold. Because someone had to do it. And because I had stopped needing his approval a long time ago. I just hadn't realized it until now. The call ended not with a click but with a quiet fading, the way lights dim when a circuit finally gives out. I stared at the phone in my hand for a moment longer, then set it down, not gently, not angrily, just done. The silence that followed didn't feel heavy. It felt honest. For once there was nothing left to pretend. There's a strange stillness that comes when your name leaves your body and enters the public. It doesn't belong to you anymore. It starts to echo in places you've never stood, spoken by voices you've never met, twisted and stretched and interpreted until the person you are becomes secondary to the image they've created. My name, Madison Clark, was no longer just mine. It was a headline, a subject line, a tag, a topic of debate on national panels and morning talk shows. Commentators argued over what I had done with the kind of authority that comes from never having to make the decision themselves. I watched as they dissected every syllable of the policy I had signed, turning legal language into battlegrounds, my intent into speculation. They showed my photo, official, cropped just right, on screens across the country. Some networks highlighted it with pride, others with veiled contempt, depending on who they thought their viewers needed me to be. But it didn't really matter because the outcome was the same. I was no longer invisible. I wasn't a supporting character or the silent sibling who missed holidays or the daughter who stayed quiet when her father scoffed at the news. I had become someone whose absence was no longer interpreted as distance, but as responsibility. My silence was no longer avoidance. It was evidence of weight I had carried without their awareness or permission. The irony was almost sharp. For years, my family had treated my absence as a choice rooted in ego or escapism, as though I had left because I didn't care or didn't want to be part of their lives. Every deployment, every reassignment, every training cycle was framed as me drifting further away from what they understood, from what they thought a daughter should be. They filled the silence with assumptions. They made my presence small even when I was there because it made it easier to justify how easily they overlooked me. And now, without any effort on my part, the world had ripped that narrative from their hands. I knew what they were seeing. My aunt posted a screenshot of me on Facebook with 3 sentences of trembling patriotism, like she had always been proud. My cousin commented about how they'd always known I was smart. I saw my stepmother's vague second-hand support shared in a post about hard decisions from strong women. Even Ethan, who had barely spoken to me in months before the night everything exploded, sent a single text, didn't think it was that big. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The shift had already happened. The story had been rewritten without my permission, and now they all had to reconcile it with the version of me they had clung to for so long. The quiet one, the absent one, the good soldier who didn't make waves. But this time the waves were all around them. They couldn't ignore what the world now saw. I wasn't background. I wasn't decoration. I wasn't just the person who showed up when needed and disappeared when things got uncomfortable. I was the reason their town was on the map, the reason reporters were calling the mayor's office, the reason someone spray-painted a question mark on the old courthouse wall. I had become central, unavoidably present whether they liked it or not. And through it all I didn't flinch. I didn't apologize. I didn't offer explanations to people who had never asked for the truth when it would have mattered. I had done my job and I had done it well. That was what no one wanted to admit. That behind all the outrage, all the speculation, all the desperate attempts to box me into a headline, was a woman who had simply carried out her duty with precision and clarity. They weren't angry because I had made a mistake. They were angry because I had made a choice that didn't center their comfort. My father didn't call again. At least not right away. But I knew he was watching. I knew he saw my name scroll across the news ticker and felt the weight of what he'd dismissed for so long. I wondered if he remembered all the times he'd said I was too rigid, too serious, too military for normal life. I wondered if he realized how quickly too much had become exactly what was needed. There was no pride in his silence, not this time. Only reckoning. I didn't ask for this spotlight. I didn't angle for attention. But now that it was here, I didn't shrink from it. I let them see me. Let them say my name. Let them finally acknowledge what I had become. Not because I wanted validation, but because I was done being erased. I had done what I was trained to do. I had made the hard call. And whether they whispered it or screamed it, the truth was now impossible to ignore. I was not a footnote in someone else's story. I was the author. And they were all just starting to catch up. The hallway outside his hospital room was quiet in that unnatural way that only medical buildings seem to manage. Machines humming behind closed doors, footsteps soft and deliberate, the air too clean, too still. I stood for a moment before pushing open the door, one hand on the frame like I needed to brace myself for whatever was waiting inside. My boots made a dull sound against the polished floor as I stepped into the room, where the light was pale and the atmosphere held the brittle silence of something fragile, like glass stretched too thin. He was awake. Propped up slightly on the bed, wires trailing from his wrist and chest to beeping monitors, skin pale beneath the fluorescent light. His eyes opened when he heard me come in, and for a second, there was something almost defensive in them, like I had caught him off guard. Ethan sat in the chair closest to the foot of the bed, arms crossed, eyes low, jaw tense. Linda stood by the window, one hand on the sill, not looking at anyone. No one said anything when I entered, and I didn't expect them to. The air in the room was thick, and not just with hospital disinfectant. It was thick with things unsaid, years of silence, things buried but never gone. I took a few steps closer, pausing at the foot of the bed. My father looked at me like he wasn't sure if I was real, like seeing me there contradicted whatever version of me he'd built to keep himself comfortable. His lips parted, dry and pale, and the words that came out were low, uncertain, maybe even resentful. "You didn't have to come." I stood still, hands at my sides, meeting his gaze with no defense, no wall, just the simplest truth I had left. "I wanted to." He didn't respond to that right away. His eyes shifted toward the monitor, toward the corner of the room, toward the floor bag, anywhere but at me. Linda turned slightly but still didn't speak. Ethan leaned back in his chair like he couldn't decide whether to defend me or disappear entirely. The silence stretched out until it started to hum beneath my skin. "I didn't know," my father said finally, the words barely above a whisper, rough like they'd been scraped from somewhere deep. He didn't clarify what he meant. He didn't need to. It was all in his face. The confusion, the hurt, the defensive pride cracked open just enough to show the soft thing underneath. I could see the years of misunderstanding folding in on themselves. I could see the realization hitting him not as some noble awakening but as an uncomfortable recognition that he'd gotten something wrong for a long time. I looked at him without blinking, my voice quiet but firm, the words precise, honed from years of silence. "You never asked." The sentence landed with more weight than I expected. He flinched, not visibly, not dramatically, but I saw it. In the shift of his eyes. In the subtle tension in his jaw. Linda sat down slowly in the corner, rubbing her hands together as if trying to warm something that had long gone cold. Ethan looked at the floor. No one said anything for a long time. In that sterile room where everything was clean and orderly, where the machines beeped like the heartbeat of something artificial, the past didn't shout. It leaked. It pressed in from all sides. Years of distance didn't evaporate, they just sat in the space between us, finally visible now that there was nowhere left to put them. I thought of every missed call, every dinner I wasn't invited to, every time he changed the subject when someone asked about me. I thought of holidays spent overseas, of letters never answered, of photos sent but never acknowledged. I thought of how he'd called me too serious when I was 17 and too distant when I was 26 and too much every year in between. And I thought of how he had benefited from every sacrifice I made, how he accepted the safety, the support, the money, the structure, just not the person who delivered it. I didn't need him to say he was sorry. I didn't need an apology carved from guilt or fear or embarrassment. I just needed him to see me. To see what he had refused to look at for so long. He looked back at me then, and for the first time in years, it wasn't through the lens of disappointment or confusion or defense. It was just him, old, tired, unsure, stripped of the walls he'd spent decades maintaining. The space between us didn't close. But it changed. Something shifted. Not forgiveness, not repair. But recognition. We sat there in that room together, all four of us suspended in a moment that was too quiet to name. The machines kept ticking. The room stayed cold. But something inside me exhaled, slow and deep, like I'd been holding my breath through years of silence. And now, finally, I could let it go. It didn't happen all at once. No dramatic outpouring, no cinematic swell of music, just a slow and awkward settling into the truth. The silence in the hospital room had stretched long enough to become unbearable, and eventually something had to give. It started with Ethan, slouched low in his chair, shoulders tense like he was bracing for impact even though none had come. His fingers tapped nervously against his thigh, and he kept glancing between me and our father like he didn't know where to land. Then he just said it, quiet, blunt, without ceremony. "I think I leaned on you too much." The words felt strange in the room, like they didn't belong at first, like they'd taken a wrong turn. I turned toward him slowly, not sure if I'd heard him right, but he kept going, eyes fixed somewhere near the base of the four stand. I always just figured you had it. That you'd figure things out. Money, advice, covering for me when I messed up at school, when Dad and I weren't talking. Hell, even when I got fired last year, I called you before I told anyone else. He paused, dragging a hand through his hair, letting out a breath like it hurt. I guess I didn't really think about what that meant for you. I didn't ask. I just assumed you'd be there. You always were. The air in the room felt thinner after that. He wasn't crying and he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was just putting the truth out in the open, and that felt heavier than any apology ever could. I nodded once because I didn't have resentment for him. I had fatigue. And in his voice I finally heard the difference between ignorance and accountability. Then Linda spoke, still seated in the corner, hands folded in her lap. Her voice was soft, more hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to speak this openly. We all leaned on you, she said, not looking at me but not looking away either. Even when we didn't say it. Especially then. When your father lost work for a while and we didn't want to tell anyone. The help you sent got us through. And we didn't say thank you. Not because we weren't grateful, but because it was easier to pretend we had it handled. She shifted a little and I watched her wrestle with the next part. It was easier to paint you as distant than to admit we were depending on someone we didn't really understand anymore. You were always gone, always busy, and that made it easy to keep you in this box. The reliable one. The strong one. The one we didn't need to worry about. But that wasn't fair. She looked at me then, and it was the first time I'd seen something like sincerity in her expression. Clear, unfiltered, not polite but real. We asked so much of you without realizing we were doing it. The quiet that followed wasn't uncomfortable this time. It felt necessary, like the room needed a moment to process what had been said, to let it settle in the air. Then my father, who hadn't spoken again since I'd told him I wanted to be there, cleared his throat. His voice was rougher now, edged with wear, like the weight of the last day had finally caught up to him. I thought I understood how things worked, he said. How families worked. How you worked. His eyes met mine, not with defiance this time, but with something closer to uncertainty. I thought I knew what mattered. I didn't. He didn't follow it with excuses. He didn't try to explain away the years of judgment, the silence, the clipped messages and avoidance. He just sat there, exposed and unsure, admitting something I don't think I ever expected him to admit. That his view of me had been shaped by comfort and pride and fear, and that none of it held up anymore. He'd built a version of me that was easier to dismiss than engage, and now he was seeing the cracks in that version. Seeing the woman behind the uniform, behind the distance, behind the decisions. I looked at each of them. I could feel the urge to soften the edges, to reassure them, to do what I'd always done. Make it easier. But I didn't. I didn't need to scream or cry. I just said what needed to be said, clearly, without hesitation. You understood when I stayed quiet. But I'm not quiet anymore. That sentence hung in the room like the final note of a song that had taken too long to end. And for once no one tried to talk over it. No one tried to fix it or challenge it or dilute it. They just let it exist. I had spent so much of my life folding myself into the corners of this family, trying not to take up too much space, trying to be useful instead of understood. But I wasn't doing that anymore. I wasn't there to ease their guilt or make them comfortable. I was there because I wanted to be. And I was speaking because I needed to, not because they were ready to hear it. The difference between those things had never been more clear. And somehow in the silence that followed I felt more seen than I ever had. Not because they finally understood everything. But because for the first time they were trying. He waited until Ethan and Linda had stepped out for coffee. The room had settled into that temporary calm that hospital spaces sometimes manage, when machines hum quietly and no one is watching the clock too closely. I knew he'd been holding something in all morning, and when the door clicked shut behind them, it rose to the surface like something sour rising in the throat. He turned his head slowly toward me, eyes still tired but sharp with purpose now, and spoke without trying to ease into it. You need to walk it back. I didn't react right away. I just looked at him. Not angry. Not surprised. Just still. He pushed again, his voice a little more urgent now, like he thought if he framed it right I'd understand. You need to say it was a miscommunication. Say the report was exaggerated. Say it wasn't your final call. He gestured vaguely toward the TV mounted in the corner, muted but still scrolling headlines, my name a persistent echo in the banner. The town's in chaos. People are calling me. They're saying I raced a traitor. I can't show my face at the post office. This isn't just about you anymore. His words landed like accusations, even though he thought he was being reasonable. That's what made it harder to listen to. Not the tone but the assumption underneath it, that it was my job to fix the discomfort of others. That the consequences of clarity were mine to clean up. I exhaled slowly, not out of exasperation, but to give myself time to temper the reply I already knew I would give. I'm not fixing something that wasn't broken, I said, each word measured but not cold. I made a legal decision. I didn't act on impulse. I didn't make a mistake. I read the documents. I understood the policy. I signed because it was right. I didn't do it to you. I did it for me. He stared at me like I'd just confessed to something criminal. You knew it would affect this town. You knew it would affect me. And you didn't care. No, I said calmly. I knew it would affect systems. I knew it would shift jurisdiction, funding, authority. I also knew the people it would affect would choose to make it personal if they couldn't see past their pride. His jaw tightened. You betrayed us. The word didn't sting. Not like it might have once. It just sounded lazy now, like a last resort when nothing else could stick. I tilted my head slightly, my voice steady. Family without respect isn't family. It's obligation. I don't owe you silence. I don't owe you self-erasure. You don't get to expect my loyalty while undermining my value. You're twisting this, he muttered, shifting in the bed, the cords pulling gently with his movement. I just want you to understand what you've done. I do understand, I said. Probably better than you ever did. I understand what it's like to be useful but never welcome. I understand how easy it was for you to accept what I gave you without acknowledging what it cost me. And I understand now that this version of family you keep asking me to protect isn't built on trust. It's built on fear, and comfort, and reputation. He didn't answer. Not right away. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he thought if he stayed quiet long enough I'd soften like I used to. I didn't. I didn't have anger left in me. Just truth. Truth stripped of apology, truth sharpened by years of swallowing back the instinct to speak plainly. I don't want to be part of a version of this family where I have to be quiet to be accepted, I said finally. You can call that betrayal. I call it survival. He looked down then, eyes drifting to his hands, the 4-needle taped into his skin, the loose hospital bracelet around his wrist. The room felt smaller, not with closeness but with the weight of something finite. Maybe his sense of control, maybe the idea he'd spent years guarding, that he could hold on to authority even if he never earned respect. I didn't say anything more. There was nothing else to explain. The divide between us had never been about politics or policy or power. It had always been about the refusal to see me as a whole person. And now, with everything stripped away, his voice, his pride, the headlines still scrolling silently above our heads, that refusal had nowhere left to hide. He didn't speak for a long time after that. The words had landed, and this time he didn't rush to throw them back at me. He sat there, not slouched, not dramatic, just still. Like something inside him had gone silent. Not out of defeat but out of recognition. For the first time in years I didn't feel like I had to fight to be heard. I wasn't pacing my words to soften their impact or preparing for the inevitable interruption. I had spoken and now he was simply listening. He looked tired. Not physically, though the hospital had certainly done its work, but in a deeper, more fundamental way, like the scaffolding of control he'd built around himself had finally buckled under the weight of everything he refused to see. He blinked slowly, glanced toward the muted television, then back at me. And still no reply. No justification. No condescension. That silence didn't feel like a tactic this time. It didn't feel like another way to make me fill in the gaps so he wouldn't have to. It felt like he was actually absorbing what I'd said, like maybe for the first time, the noise in his own head wasn't drowning out mine. I stayed where I was, standing near the foot of the bed, hands loose at my sides, posture relaxed but unshaken. My voice, when I spoke again, was quiet but not soft. There was no trembling in it, no need to prove anything. If we can't talk without trying to win, I said, we don't talk at all. It was a line drawn, not out of anger but out of necessity. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was a boundary, clear and unflinching, the kind that doesn't ask for approval. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean in. I didn't ask him to agree. I just said it and then let it sit. Because this wasn't about winning anymore. Not for me. That game had never interested me. I'd spent most of my life letting him believe he was the loudest voice in the room, the most important one. I'd allowed him that comfort not because I thought he deserved it, but because I was too exhausted to pull against a current that never slowed. But things were different now. I wasn't who I had been. And I wasn't willing to shrink again just to preserve a version of family that required my silence. He swallowed once, a visible shift in his throat, and when he finally looked at me again, his expression wasn't angry. It wasn't smug. It was unfamiliar. Somewhere between surprised and stripped bare. I could see that he knew something had changed, not just in the conversation but in the foundation of it. He understood now, even if he couldn't articulate it yet, that the dynamic he'd held onto for so long no longer existed. He wasn't the sole authority anymore. He wasn't the only one with a voice that mattered. There was no performance in me. No theater of rebellion. I had nothing left to prove. I'd spent my life proving things, to him, to myself, to the silence between us, and I was done with that now. I stood there as I was, not as he wanted me to be. And I let him see me, unbent and unedited. It was strange watching him sit with that realization. He didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He didn't reach for the tired tools of authority or lineage or parental entitlement. He just looked at me and nodded once, almost imperceptibly. I think that was his way of acknowledging it, not in words, but in surrendering to the fact that his voice would no longer be the only one that shaped the room. Something about the silence between us felt different now. Not unresolved but honest. Like whatever happened next would happen on new ground, stripped of hierarchy, of assumption, of the easy power he used to hold without question. For once we were eye to eye. And he didn't look away. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where nothing dramatic seemed likely to happen. The sky outside my apartment was washed in soft winter light, the kind that stretches through the windows without warmth, and I was folding laundry with the quiet rhythm of someone who finally had room to breathe. My phone rang, and when I saw his name I didn't feel dread. I didn't feel anger or defensiveness. I felt curious. His voice on the other end wasn't sharp or rehearsed. It was tentative, as though he'd dialed and let it ring without expecting me to answer. "Hey," he said, and then paused like he wasn't sure where to go from there. "I was just, wondering how you were doing." There was a silence after that, not heavy but cautious. A pause that felt less like avoidance and more like effort. The kind that takes energy when you're used to speaking only in directives or judgments. I told him I was fine, and I meant it. The conversation didn't go anywhere specific. He asked about the weather. I asked if the roof at the firehouse had finally been fixed. We spoke about nothing in particular, and then it was over. But he called again a few days later. And then again. Each call was slightly less stiff. He didn't pretend to know everything anymore. Sometimes he asked questions he never would have asked before. About my work, about decisions I'd made, about why things mattered to me. There were long silences between our words, but not the resentful kind. They were pauses filled with thought, the space people leave when they're trying to build something unfamiliar with their own hands. He didn't try to reclaim the authority he'd once clung to. He didn't ask me to explain who I'd become. He just listened. And every time we hung up, it felt like one more layer had shifted. Less tension, less posing, less resistance to who I really was. Ethan started changing too. Slowly, yes, but noticeably. He texted more often, not out of need but just to check in. He stopped asking for money. He mentioned a job he'd applied for without asking me to edit the resume. He even brought up therapy, offhand and awkward, like saying it too directly might undo the thought. I didn't push. I just listened. And for once, I didn't feel like I was holding up the whole structure of this family alone. And I felt lighter. Not in the way people mean when they talk about healing, like some perfect cinematic turn, but in a real physical way. I walked more, sometimes for no reason other than that the air felt good and the movement kept my head clear. I slept deeper, not because my mind was empty but because it was finally quiet. I stopped scanning my phone with dread. I stopped crafting responses in my head before someone even spoke. I no longer lived on the defensive. I was no longer anticipating the next sharp word, the next accusation, the next reminder that my life made other people uncomfortable. For the first time in years, I wasn't preparing for battle. I wasn't shrinking or explaining. I wasn't walking into rooms with armor already on. I was just living, moving through my days without needing permission, without fearing backlash, for simply existing as I am. The silence in my apartment no longer felt like absence. It felt like space. Even my home felt different. The rooms didn't press in as much. The framed photo above the TV, the one of me in uniform standing beside my father, still sat where it always had. But I looked at it differently now. Not with longing or bitterness but with distance. Perspective. I had outgrown the need to extract meaning from it. Could just be a moment, nothing more. This new rhythm wasn't perfect. There were still awkward calls, still things we avoided talking about. But they didn't carry the same weight anymore. There was no longer a script I felt forced to follow. I wasn't the quiet one or the useful one or the one expected to smooth things over. I was just me. Present. Whole. Untethered from the old dynamics that once defined every breath I took around them. I didn't wait for more calls and I didn't count on consistency. That wasn't the point. The shift had already happened and I didn't need constant proof to validate it. I had my peace and for now that was enough. I wasn't trying to be understood in every word or decision. I was simply living without apology. And that, for the first time in a long time, felt like freedom. Spring came slowly that year, not in a rush of warmth and color but in quiet shifts. The snow melted gradually along the curbs, the air softened without fully losing its edge, and the trees outside my building started to breathe again, their bare branches showing the first hints of green. It was a season I'd always noticed in pieces, but never fully felt in my body the way I did now. There was something different about this version of spring. Something less symbolic and more real. Less about reinvention, more about presence. He called first a week before. Asked if he could stop by. His voice was flat but not cold, as if the question itself was unfamiliar in his mouth. I said yes without hesitation, and not because I felt obligated. I said yes because I wanted to see what this version of him would be like in my space. Not on his terms, not in some forced neutral zone, but here where I had built something solid. He arrived mid-morning on a Sunday. No dramatic entrance, no heavy silence between us. Just a knock on the door, a brief moment of stillness, and then him standing there with a hesitant nod and a six-pack of decent beer, like he wasn't sure what else you're supposed to bring when visiting a daughter you've only recently started seeing as an equal. I let him in and we stood in the entryway for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then I gestured toward the living room and he walked in slowly, scanning the space without commenting too much. The apartment wasn't anything grand. Clean lines, a few houseplants, framed photos on the walls, shelves arranged with equal parts practicality and care. He took it in with eyes that didn't carry judgment this time, and after a few minutes he said it without ceremony. You built a good life. The words landed softly, not as an epiphany or an apology, but as a simple truth, and I appreciated that. No grand gestures. No emotional weight forced into a single moment. Just an acknowledgement that was long overdue but still welcome. We sat for a while. Not stiffly, not like strangers trying to patch something broken, but like two people learning how to exist around each other without pretending. We talked about my mother. His memories sharper than I expected, full of small, specific details. The way she laughed when she cooked, the old music she played too loudly on Sunday mornings, the way she used to correct his grammar without ever raising her voice. I hadn't heard him say her name out loud in years, and hearing it again in my living room felt like opening a window that hadn't been touched in too long. We didn't linger in grief. We didn't dissect the past with the goal of rewriting it. We let it be what it was. He didn't try to defend the silences or explain away the years we'd lost to tension. He didn't offer hollow regret. And I didn't need him to. That, more than anything, felt like progress. The absence of blame. The absence of strategy. Just the quiet coexistence of what was and what could still be. After a while, he leaned back slightly and looked at me. Not with authority, not with that quiet challenge he used to wear in his eyes, but with something more open, something closer to curiosity. Then he asked the question I never thought I'd hear from him. What do you want? I didn't have to think long. I didn't hesitate. I answered with the kind of clarity that comes when you've been answering that question for yourself in 1,000 different ways for years, even when no one asked. Honesty. Respect. Effort. He nodded. Not quick or dismissive. He sat with it for a second, then gave a short, thoughtful nod like he was mentally turning the words over, trying them on. He didn't say he could promise them. He didn't launch into a speech. But he heard me. Fully. And that was enough. Not a resolution. Not a confession. Just the start of something that didn't require us to rebuild the past to move forward. We didn't need to pretend that everything had changed overnight. We just needed to know that it could change if we let it. If we stopped measuring our relationship by the space we took from each other, and started measuring it by the space we were finally willing to make. There was no countdown, No clock ticking toward some artificial reconciliation deadline. Just a new beginning. Quiet. And finally ours.